is closed caption. So if you need to see captions, just enable closed caption with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. It is currently being recorded because hopefully we'll be able to use this on a YouTube channel as a constant tool to teach people how to use the Follow the Forest application. And we're kind of going to do a Q&A as we go through the night tonight, just because it's a smaller crowd. It's a kind of opportunity to just chat with each other. It's more of a classroom setting. So that's kind of how we like to do it tonight. Just as an outline, we're going to quickly go through a little bit about the Dutchess Land Conservancy and then a little bit about our education and community science and volunteer program, of which this is a part of. Then I'm going to kick it over to Julia, and she'll go through a background on Housatonic Valley Association, and then really the meat of the presentation, which is what is Follow the Forest and how do I use it? And then we'll kind of wrap it up with the way in which the DLC can support the individuals who want to use the tool. So just to get to what is the DLC portion. So the Dutchess Land Conservancy is a land trust. For those of you who don't know what that is, this is the kind of the definition as given by the Land Trust Alliance, which is kind of the mothership of all land trusts. It's a nonprofit organization that's basically its work is to conserve land, and that's through two functions. And what we do is mainly through conservation easements. So that's a application in which development rights are removed from land, putting it into permanent protection. And then we also go out and steward those lands. So we make sure that all the conditions in the conservation easement are met and the development standards are up to par. And we do it a lot. Excuse me, the Dutchess Land Conservancy has protected over 46,000 acres in Dutchess County, which when you think about being, 100 miles away from the world's largest metropolitan area, it's pretty darn good. We feel very fortunate to be supported by everyone who supports us, including everyone here tonight and on Zoom. We're accredited by the Land Trust accreditation. We're in the top 3% nationwide in terms of areas protected, acres protected by conservation easements, and the top 1% nationally of the number of easements held. So pretty proud of all those numbers. And what that boils down to, this is kind of I put the stream there because it's the kind of the downstream effects side. So 46,000 acres, what does that mean? That breaks down into 20,000 acres of farmland, 20,000 acres of forest, 5,000 acres of water, and that all protects a lot of things. So that protects not only the bucolic imagery and sites you see when you drive around Dutchess County. It protects our agricultural industry. It protects our tourism industry. It protects our forests, which protects habitat and wildlife connectivity, which we'll be talking about tonight. It's a major carbon sink. And then the areas of water protect a great deal of stormwater influx and riparian areas to manage all that. So the downstream benefits that are innumerable. And as a part of a land trust, we have our educational program that's been going for quite some time. So this is where we get to go out and teach people, much like tonight, about the conservation tools and good land stewardship practices that we can all be a part of. And we provide that through a myriad of different ways, this being one of them, both in person and online events. We regularly talk to municipalities, schools, general public, business associations, and private landowners about best management practices and conservation tools. And then a couple of years back, underneath the education program, started the volunteer community science program, which this is a part of tonight. We look forward to our volunteer program as, of course, community science is nested underneath there, but we also do trail development and preserve maintenance. We have volunteers lead events. We've had a lot of success with volunteers leading educational events. Outreach event support, photography and videography, administrative help. Folks come into the office and help us out with administration stuff. Translation, we have a volunteer who translates our newsletter for us, which is incredible. And always put other down there, because when you sign up for our volunteer program, there's a little space for what are your skill sets and how can they apply to a conservation organization. You'd be surprised at stuff that people put in there, a lot of cool things. So yeah, this tonight is part of the community science portion of our volunteer program, which is nestled underneath our education program. And we are very excited. I'm personally very excited to learn the tool as well, because hopefully pretty soon I'll be leading some events using the Follow the Forest tool. And so yeah, I'm going to be taking notes too, Julia.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would like to now pass it over to Julia.
Excellent. And I think I'm actually gonna sit because the owl couldn't decide where on you it wanted to focus. Which is like kind of weird for me because I'm a standing type of person, but I think I'm gonna sit so that everyone on Zoom can see. And I can then, it's a conversation, we can all talk. Alrighty. So I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the Housatonic Valley Association and the work that we do. So the map on the screen on the right is showing the Housatonic watershed, or the area where all of the water that falls there ultimately drains to the Housatonic and ultimately the Long Island Sound. You can see that much of eastern Dutchess County is within the Housatonic watershed. Generally, we refer to it as the 10-mile watershed. That's sort of the largest tributary that a lot of eastern Dutchess County flows to. We are a regional watershed organization and land trust working to protect the environmental health of this region. And we do so oftentimes through partnerships with folks like the Dutchess Land Conservancy. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Brian and Julie, for all the work that you did to bring this together. Our work falls under sort of two main initiatives: the Follow the Forest initiative, which we're going to talk a lot more about here shortly, and then also our Clean, Cold, and Connected initiative, which is all about promoting healthy waters with clean water with cold temperatures to maintain trout populations and other species that rely on them, making sure they're connected so that fish can pass through them, but also that we as humans are connected to these water resources, whether that's the rivers and streams that flow through our areas or the drinking water that we all rely on. So Follow the Forest is this big idea that we can protect and connect a forested wildlife corridor that you're seeing on the screen here. So the green that's sort of popping out at you a little bit are what we call core forests. So these are large blocks of contiguous interior forest, over 250 acres in size, that we've mapped out throughout this landscape. We drew our boundaries at the Hudson River and the Connecticut River for a couple of reasons. First, as the Housatonic Valley Association, we can only get away with thinking so far outside of our watershed boundaries. But also, if you think about climate change and the impacts that climate change is having on our landscape, one of them is that these two large rivers no longer freeze over like they used to. I've heard stories in Cold Spring, New York, along the Hudson, that folks used to be able to walk to West Point when the river would freeze over, and since I've lived in this region, we've never seen that happen. So it's interesting to not only think about how that separates us as humans, but how are wildlife now passing across these large rivers, particularly ones that have strong currents at times, and so what sorts of barriers they serve. So Hudson and Connecticut are big boundaries there. The dark green are core forests. The blue is, again, that Housatonic watershed, just to give you a little bit of an idea of scale. And the brown line that runs through the map is the Appalachian Trail. So this region, this area covers 4 states: Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont, and is really a climate significant wildlife corridor. So in order to achieve this big vision, we work really closely with partners across all 4 states in a number of different fashions. We take this concept and we bring it down to the local level and do a lot of strategic conservation planning to say, we know where these last remaining big blocks of forest are. What does it look like at the town level or at the county level? And what does that mean for conservation efforts and each of our own stewardship efforts? We work closely with community scientists, which we're going to really dive into that tool today to really inform the conservation planning and the rest of our work from this critical data that the community scientists are collecting. And all of this work is highlighted and informed by the most recent and up-to-date science. We utilize science from both the Nature Conservancy and the University of Massachusetts to really inform and feed into all of our work. So I wanted to come to this concept of connectivity. Why connectivity? Why does it matter? And I'm going to walk you through all of the different images on this slide. So if we start on the far left-hand side with the map that's on the far left, you're seeing all of these colors pop out at you. And the red that dominates most of New York and New England are a general categorization of forests, and those are generally speaking maple, beech, and birch forests. So this is obviously a really coarse scale, right? We have a lot more forest diversity than that on our landscape, but generally speaking, our forests are often dominated by those species. Now, scientists have projected that by 2070 and moving into 2100, that our forests are going to heavily change under the influences of climate change and move more to this dark green color, which are the oak hickory forests. So the concept here is, and again, this is a really generalized model of what could happen under climate change scenarios, but the concept is our ecosystems are going to change, our forest types are going to change, and species need to be able to move along with that change. So whether that's adapting ranges north to access temperatures and precipitation regimes that are more normal, or whether that's shifting upwards to again try to access some of those cooler temperatures, all of these range shifts are now critically important and are ever more important as we move forward under climate change scenarios. At the same time, and perhaps a little bit more happily, species need to move in general as part of their life cycle, right? We are all probably in this room because we have an interest in conservation. You all probably know a lot of sort of these general facts, but species need to move, whether that's to access food or water or shelter, or as part of their reproductive cycle. So I put the amphibian up there, the salamander up there, and I'm going to come back to them because they're one of my favorite examples of how connectivity works on our landscape. And then lastly, we as humans also need to be connected to these natural open spaces. I would also guess that a lot of folks in this room have some connection to the outdoors, and that's what sort of started to bring you into this space. And we know, based on some of these most recent scientific studies, that being out in nature improves our own mental health and really helps us as a society and as individuals. So promoting connectivity for all of these reasons is really critical. So I want to take a moment and give you a couple of examples, because oftentimes when I start talking about connectivity, people look at me and they say, well, Julia, I see bear and deer and turkey all the time. Why does connectivity matter on our landscape? We have a lot of wildlife. And so I like to give a couple of examples. So I'm going to give you two, and I'm going to start with the black bear. So black bears are a really interesting example. They've been moving more and more into our landscapes in recent years. And the picture on the right is actually from Winchester, Connecticut, so just about an hour to the east of where we're sitting in this building. And it shows you this mama bear trying to get her cubs across. There was a whole video that was shown on the news for a while in Connecticut of these troublesome 3 little cubs that didn't want to move across the road. And you can see the traffic in the background. So it's sort of like, right, we can all connect with this. I've seen a number of black bear trying to cross the road. So the question is, what sort of barriers do roads serve for these bears? Why do we care? Well, the bears are again moving because they need food and shelter and water. And scientists have studied bears by putting heart rate trackers or heart rate monitors on them along with GPS trackers to start to understand when they exhibit stress responses. So basically when the heart rate is more elevated than they would expect based on the movement that they're seeing on the GPS tracker. And what they find is particularly female bears with their cubs exhibit a stress response near busy roads, and that they will choose to avoid the road and wait to cross the road until it's a quieter time of day. So usually, late at night when there's a lot less cars on the road. Bears serve really important ecosystem functions, including helping to disperse seeds and also helping with decomposition in our forests. So it's interesting to think about how their choice of movement could be impacting some of those really critical characteristics. But what's also noteworthy is that this behavior of avoidance is really typical of a lot of our larger species. Bobcats exhibit similar responses, and I believe coyotes do as well. So this is really typical of a lot of these mammals, to avoid our roads until it's less busy. What scientists have also found is that when we change our time for daylight savings time, on both ends in the fall and the spring, there's an increased rate of roadkill because all of a sudden our habits have changed. But we didn't clue the wildlife in on this, so all of a sudden we're moving an hour earlier or later, and they were not expecting that. So it's interesting to think about, right, how all of these patterns ultimately influence the world where we live. Now, I told you we'd come back to the amphibians, so I'm going to come back to the amphibians, the frogs and the salamanders, because they're my favorite example about connectivity. They are our best example of a large migration, right? Like, you say connectivity and probably a lot of people think about the elk moving out west or something. And we don't have that, but we have the frogs and the salamanders. So every spring in the late winter, early spring, the frogs and the salamanders move from their winter hibernation grounds to their spring breeding grounds. So generally they're hibernating in the woods, and their breeding grounds are these vernal pools, which are seasonal bodies of water that are also going to be found in the woods, but oftentimes these two areas are separated by roads. So they migrate when it's dark and rainy. So the first really warm, rainy nights of spring, you'll find the frogs and salamanders moving, and they tend to move in big groups. And so in the Hudson Valley of New York, so all around here, volunteers go out, and this happens around the Northeast, volunteers go out and help these salamanders and frogs across the road to try to reduce the amount of roadkill. They also collect data. So in 2019, volunteers across the Hudson Valley found nearly 3,000 live amphibians and counted nearly 1,500 dead amphibians. What's interesting is the next year, in 2020, we were at the height of lockdown for the COVID pandemic. A few volunteers still went out and collected data. And while the numbers overall were smaller because there were less volunteers, they found that the amount of roadkill was far less because there were less cars on the road. So it's a really interesting example of, if you change our behavior, the wildlife see better responses. So I think it's interesting to think about, particularly with amphibians, is that we could consider in areas where there's rare, threatened, or endangered species, perhaps closing down that road for that night where we know it's the big night. They do it for construction. Driving on 684, and they were telling me the road was going to be closed starting at midnight. You know, they do this on big interstates. So it's not out of the realm of the possible that we say this section of road is closed tonight so that the rare species can move through, and perhaps their population can thrive.
See anybody building those tunnels sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes they build tunnels. I'm gonna get there too. Yeah. But so to have this connectivity, we then have to identify those connections. So bringing back to this big follow the forest map, again, that dark green are those large blocks of interior forest. Identifying those large blocks is fairly simple. We use aerial imagery, but identifying the connections is much more challenging. So using data from both the Nature Conservancy and the University of Massachusetts, we're able to get a pretty good regional idea of where there might be really important connections on our landscape, but all of us are missing really critical local data. We're missing information on where the barriers or other items are that might shift wildlife movement. So things like fencing or steep embankments or guardrails or other things that are going to shift or change behavior for wildlife. So we've taken this data, and it's okay that you can't see too much on this map, but we've taken this data and we've drawn circles on the map. So now you're seeing a little bit of purple start to show up on this map. And essentially we said, we expect, based on computer modeling, there to be really good connectivity in these areas, but we need volunteers to go out on the ground and really understand, if we're going to create action, we need to truly understand what it looks like on the ground so that we can then know the solutions for improving connectivity. So I actually was playing with numbers today, and that number on that slide is a little bit outdated. We now have nearly 850 circles drawn from southern New York all the way to Vermont, these purple circles, that we're having folks go out and walk that section of road and give us a good idea of what the conditions look like on the ground.
Wait, so what are those? Those are opportunities?
Those are potential areas for connectivity that we need people to help us understand. Sometimes, and you will find this, sometimes you go out to one of these purple circles and it turns out it's actually in a subdivision and the best spot is just up the road. Some of that's the scaling of the data, And sometimes we just don't have enough information to really know what those local conditions look like. So really having the local perspective on the ground helps us to be able to form a plan for improving connectivity. And Dutchess County is particularly key for that connectivity. So I've zoomed in a little bit. Again, the dark green are the core forests. The purple circles are those wildlife linkages. The ones that are really popping out at you are ones that have been assessed. So those ones that are lightly filled in with a light purple, we've already had some volunteers or some of our interns go out and look at those linkages. What you can't see as well, at least from where I'm sitting, are the ones that are not yet assessed, but there's still plenty of those as well. And Dutchess County sits at the critical junction between the Hudson Highlands and the Litchfield Hills and Berkshires. So you are that connecting point, and if we don't maintain connectivity here and don't think about how wildlife are moving, the Hudson Highlands could be disconnected from the Litchfield Hills and Berkshires. So in Dutchess County, there are 78 linkages that are currently identified, and we have assessed about 23% of them. You can see that they're pretty heavily concentrated within the Housatonic watershed. I've been sending a lot of our summer interns out to collect a lot of good data this summer. So trying to really get a good handle on where connectivity exists within those circles. We designed our tool so that nearly anyone can collect this data and provide us with really good data. We wanted this to be really easily accessible. It's a really large task, right? It's about 850 circles, which to me feels overwhelming, and I've been doing this for a few years. So we wanted anyone to be able to go out and give us good data so we could understand those local conditions. So we have had as young as middle schoolers going out. We have worked with some of the classes to teach them all about wildlife connectivity and then go out and do an on-the-ground exercise. We work with land trust staff and volunteers and other interested members of the public to get them trained on doing linkage assessments, and we've also worked with high school students. So now we're really going to dive into the nuts and bolts of how to assess a linkage. And I think my next slide is going to show a series of QR codes that's going to lead you to each of the tools. For those of you in the room, we also have printouts. If you want to grab one, you can, but you do not have to. So in order to assess a linkage, the first step is going to be to review the interactive map. So that map is a lot like Google Maps. We created it using ArcGIS products. You can enter your address and it'll zoom right to your address. You can zoom around, pan around, see those areas that you're really interested in and see how the data overlaps and select a linkage. Once you've selected a linkage, you're going to want to bring a series of items with you when you go out to look at this linkage. I highly recommend orange reflective vests or other brightly colored clothing so that cars can see you. And then you're going to want to bring either a printout of the form or your cell phone with you so that you know what data you're trying to collect. Ultimately, all of this data is going to go to an online form. However, when you have spotty cell service, the online form does not always stay loaded. So I really recommend pen and paper. I think notes are better anyway on pen and paper. So I think that the data we get is better when you write it down than when you use your cell phone. So I highly recommend bringing pen and paper. You will also likely want to bring a map of some sort with you. I always just screenshot the map on my cell phone so that I have a static version of it. You could also print out the map and bring that with you. So those are sort of the 3 key items to take with you. You're then going to just walk or drive along that section of road and collect the data, which is a really simple collection of data. Please only walk the road if you have a safe spot to pull over and you feel comfortable walking that road. You will notice when you look at the map that there are some circles on I-84 and the Taconic and Interstate 90, and I don't expect anyone to walk those. I find that when it's a linkage that you feel like you need to drive, it's really great if you have one person driving the car and one person taking the notes. You can get almost as good of data that way as you can when you walk the road. Thank you. After you have walked or driven the road and collected the data, You're then gonna go to the online form and submit that assessment.
So it's always a link, not a trail.
Always a road. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I always thought that I was doing conservation and before that ecology to be deep in the woods, and everything I've done has brought me to the roads. My master's research was on roads, and now here I am, so I feel you on that one. It's like, I'm gonna be in the woods, it's gonna be awesome.
You can reward yourself with a hike.
That. It's actually really interesting studying roads though. And you'll have a whole new perspective when you drive them now.
I used to work in the complex. I know
Yeah.
it's,
Oh yeah, it's not that bad. So you'll submit your assessment via the online form, and we do have you do this multi-step process. And part of the reason we have you do that is because, again, the data is so much better when you have to go through and relook at your notes and write it out than when you quickly scribble something down and turn it in. And I'm speaking from my own personal perspective of having done this, that I'm gonna scribble some notes while I'm out in the field, and anyone else looking at it is gonna be like, what were you looking at? So it's really helpful to have this two-step process. The data then comes directly to me, and I review the data. We have a little bit of quality control just to make sure the data that we're receiving meets the standard that we want and that we're getting good, solid data. I can't progress my slide.
we get graded.
No.
No pressure.
Everyone have always submitted good data to me.
Okay.
I had to work a little bit with our summer interns, just to make sure that they were collecting data at the level I wanted them to.
Sure.
But all of our volunteers have always provided me with really good data.
Cool.
Thank you. So after I review the data gets uploaded to our interactive map. So you will be able to see each of the linkages you assessed and be able to see practically in real time your work being uploaded to this map. That also means that our partners can work with us and see that data and explore the areas they're interested in. So you will learn quickly, we're really all about transparency. We want to work closely with folks and have this be something that not only works for us, but works for all of our partners. And then lastly, your data really has the ability to have a lasting impact on connectivity and on the landscape, and I'll get more into that towards the end.
You're gonna tell us what the data is, like a clue, okay.
Yeah. So up here on the screen are 3 QR codes. Brian's also gonna send this out probably tomorrow so that you all have it. All of our programming and community science work is housed on followtheforest.org. Very easy to remember, so you can always go there to re-find the information. But those will get you to the interactive map as well as this the assessment form. We have the online version of the form and a printout of the form. They're ever so slightly different, mostly just formatting to make it look prettier when you print it than the way we do it online. So I'm going to walk through some of the frequently asked questions, and then I'll get to, as I do that, I'll get to the data that you're collecting. So first and foremost, when you open up the linkage assessment form, the first question is going to be, what is your potential linkage ID and what are the core forest IDs? And people always look at me and they say, Julia, what are you talking about? This is how I connect your data to what I'm looking at on my screen. So I use GIS programming to connect your survey responses with basically the polygons that I see on my screen. So these are the numbers that are going to fuse the two. If at any point you ever get confused, you're also going to input the road section and the town. So that's going to help me too, to be able to say my number is matching your number and the location. And don't let this stop you from submitting a form to me. We can coordinate via email if you're like, wow, I really don't know. But our interactive map is set up in a way that you can click on anything and these boxes are going to pop up at you. And they're going to give you a little bit of information. So when you're on the interactive map, that's sort of the interface that you're going to see. And if anyone has questions, we can always do a live demo afterwards. I'll take over, Julie. And you click on the wildlife linkage and this box pops up and it says habitat linkage : and then a number. And that number is your potential linkage ID. So in this case, I think it says 293. So that's going to be the linkage ID that you'll write in that spot. In the same vein, you're going to click or tap if you're on a phone directly on the core forest ID, and a box is gonna pop up. And our core forests are delineated by 6-digit numbers. And so you'll write at least 2 core forest IDs in the boxes for that, because you're always connecting one forest to another. Occasionally, you're connecting 3 forests. So 1 linkage goes to 2 core forests. So I'm gonna do a little bit more nuts and bolts about the linkages and what happens when you look at the map. The next question I often get is sometimes these circles, so the orange circle on the map, are gonna cover 2 different roads. So in this case, we're actually on the border of New York and Connecticut in this example in Dover. The pink line running through the screen is the Appalachian Trail. In this case, our linkage circle is covering Route 55 and a quieter back road that I think is Hoyt Road. In this case, you would fill out 2 assessment forms, 1 for each road, because they're going to have really distinct characteristics, and it's going to be hard to wrap up the characteristics of each road within 1 form. Part of this is we ask about traffic speeds and quantity, and so the traffic on Route 55 is going to be really different than that back road. So being able to distinguish those is much easier to do in 2 forms than in 1.
I could cover the whole distance within that?
That is an excellent question, and I'm sort of going to get at that in my next question. So we have these vague circles defined, and I often, when I go out to assess a linkage, I will drive the stretch of road, and I will often drive more than the linkage itself, right? Because this is computer modeling that has suggested the circle should be where it is, but it's possible there's better connection points on one end or the other. So sometimes it's really helpful if it's a road you travel every day or on a fairly regular basis that you're familiar with. Or if it's not, you can drive sort of a slightly longer stretch to get a feel for what it looks like on either end. And then from there, you can say, this is the area with the most natural land cover, whether that's farm fields or forest or wetlands or other natural habitat, more natural habitat types than housing and other developments, and really choose to focus in on that. So in the scenario of that linkage there, I would drive either end, find a spot that was safe to park, and then walk what I felt was the most important stretch of the linkage. So it's not always going to be perfect to just do the linkage itself. The same is true that you have the ability to add new linkage circles. So someday we want to be able to say that every core forest in the corridor is connected, and yet we don't have circles drawn between every core forest. So this is an example up in northeastern Dutchess County, where we have 2 core forests on the screen, but we don't yet have a linkage circle in between. And part of this, again, is the scale of that connectivity modeling. That, you know, it just didn't really crop up as one of the most important regional connectors, but it doesn't mean that it's not critical. So we really think about that local connectivity. So if this were your road or a road you were familiar with, you could probably from your own knowledge know where you were going to go on the road. And if not, you could drive the stretch of road where there was forest on either side and choose that area that's the best linkage. From
Okay, that's one.
yeah. Go ahead.
So are we looking for this is a place where we need linkage, right? So we're looking for the place that has the best linkage or the worst?
We want to know between
Are we
any,
trying to find the problem area, or are we trying to find?
we want to know the best area.
The best
Right now, we're looking for the best area.
Okay.
I do ask you a question on the form that gets at your question, which is this the only possible linkage between the 2 forests, or are there other options? And that's really to get at, right now, I want to know the best option, but in theory, there's multiple options. And as we think about the other needs of our community, right, we all know that conservation is one piece of a balanced landscape, that it's possible that could turn into a development, or maybe it has other needs, and we need to know if there are other connectivity pieces, or if we need to be arguing for this is the most important piece of connectivity in this space, right? So there's a lot that goes into that
So we're looking
question.
for the best.
Right now, I want the
We want to
best.
sustain that or make it better.
Right, because the idea.
The worst makes sense, because you create a link.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. Right now, I'm operating under the assumption that most of our forests still have linkages. There are areas where you're gonna tell me there are only terrible linkages left. And there's work to be done to improve those linkages. But right now, we wanna know like, where's the best area? So that we can try to keep it that way. So when you're delineating a new linkage, this is a screenshot from the online form. You're gonna, as I mentioned earlier, you're always gonna tell me what road you're on. So I wrote road section, and that confuses some people. You can just write the name of the road. Some people give me more details, but you can just write the name of the road that you're on. There's also a field for town. It helps if you put town and state, because we share a lot of town names in New England. So make sure, especially when you're creating a new linkage, that you put the road name on it. If you're creating a new linkage where it says potential linkage ID, if you just put in that field new or 0 or something, that's perfect. Leaving it blank, I discovered, confuses me. I had someone do that, and I thought for a minute they just forgot to fill in that linkage. So I was trying to find the linkage, and then I realized it was a new linkage. So if you could write something in that field, that helps me out. And then you have to tell me where this linkage is, right? You've told me road and town, but you're the one delineating a brand new linkage. You have options. On the online form, there's an interactive map where you can draw a polygon. Super straightforward. You're just going to draw out that polygon, and that's what I will then take and put into the map. Some people have found that to be a little bit challenging, so I have 2 other options for you. You can take a paper map and draw your linkage on it and take a picture of that and send it to me, or give it to Brian and Brian will get it to me. And that's a second way of doing it. Or if you have location services turned on your cell phone, you can take a picture at one end and the other end of the linkage and send those pictures to me. And with our GIS software, we can pull the location off of those photos, and I'll draw the linkage that way. So any one of those 3 options is all good for me. We really want this to be simple and easy for folks, even though some of this is like logistics heavy and a little bit mapping heavy. So then, under that same vein, there are instances where we've drawn the linkage, right? I've said this a couple times, but it's not perfect. You need to move the linkage. You say, well, your linkage is here, and we need to shift it. So the example on the screen is actually what someone sent to me when they filled out a linkage assessment form asking me to move that linkage. So they took a screenshot of the map and drew on it where they wanted the linkage to be moved to. They even gave me a lot of details as to why, which was perfect. It was helpful for me to understand what they were seeing on the ground that shifted that linkage. And in this scenario, you're going out to an existing linkage circle, but you need to move it. Assess the area where you're moving the linkage circle to. So you can forget about where the original circle was and assess the area that you say is the better area. And in that instance, again, you can do what that volunteer did and take a screenshot and draw on the map and send that to me, or use the online form and use the interactive map to draw that new circle for me. In each of these instances, you're going to use the original linkage ID to connect to that circle, because we'll get rid of the old circle and draw the new one. Any questions on those pieces?
Hopefully, it's easier to understand what we're doing.
All right, so we're going to start to dive into the questions. So you get through all these logistics, and that's all really going to happen either when you're going to your interactive map to choose your linkage from the get-go, or on the back end where you go to submit the data, you are going to go ahead and pull all of that information. The first question we have that confuses people in terms of on the ground categories is this question about whether the linkage is funneled into a pinch point or if wildlife movement is fairly spread out. So I wanted to use a couple of images to sort of describe to you what I'm thinking. So when a linkage is funneled into a pinch point, we're really thinking there's limited space throughout this landscape for wildlife to move, limited optimal space, right? We see wildlife in our backyards, but where are the spaces that are best for them to move? So in this photo, you can see these big developments, there's sort of limited forest, and it's really this pinch point. that if wildlife are choosing to move in the most optimal spaces, they're really going to be funneled into that strip of forested land to be able to move between these large developments. On the other hand, this is much more like Dutchess County and Columbia County. You have these big open spaces that are often a mix of farmland and forested lands, and it often looks much more like this, where wildlife are moving fairly freely between what's often natural spaces. Farmland is always an interesting example. A lot of species will move freely through it, but some will only move if there's good edge cover, and it can be a big barrier for a lot of species like amphibians. So farmland's a little bit interesting, but for the most part, landscapes like this one are going to be fairly wide open. So I was doing this exercise in Columbia County, and people looked at me like I had 10 heads when we asked this question. And I think it's very similar, especially in this part of Dutchess County. So this is sort of what we're thinking when we think about whether things are funneled into a pinch point or spread out. So the next question you're going to get to on your form, we ask about traffic. So we want to know how wide the road is, what the speed limit is, and how much traffic in general you're seeing. What you will find is that I don't ask you to count the cars. I don't ask you to tell me how long you were there and the number of cars you saw, but I ask you, is it a fairly quiet road or is it really busy? And these are a little bit of subjective readings. And my scientific background, when I looked at this, said, what are we doing? We need hard numbers. But what we've found with nearly 300 linkages now assessed is this data falls out on the scales you'd expect it to. Across our organization, we know a lot of these linkage areas, and each one, the answer the volunteer is giving us fits with our own knowledge of this landscape. So while we're asking you this subjective reading, it really fits in with what the road conditions truly are. So we ask you about traffic. We ask you if there are any signs of wildlife. So did you see anything while you were out there? If you didn't and you travel the road regularly, if you know for sure that you saw a black bear there the other day, you can tell me that you saw a black bear. Most folks are not going to see wildlife while they're out and about assessing a linkage. I've yet to see one while I'm assessing a linkage, and I hope someday I can tell you I did. So you are welcome to tell me about other wildlife sightings as long as you are sure that you saw it in that area. So good confidence behind it. After you cover road conditions and wildlife, we also ask you about the amount of development that's in the linkage. So trying to understand, occasionally there's scattered houses throughout the woods. Oftentimes it's going to be a nice quiet back road with very limited development, but trying to understand the density of development within the linkage. The next part, we're going to ask you about habitat types on either side of the road. So I often get the question of, well, how do you know based on my form anything about this linkage? And it's these habitat types that are really going to help us to understand who's trying to move throughout that landscape. We have a lot of wetlands and maybe a big riparian corridor. We're going to be thinking about other species than if we're talking about a mix of upland forest and farmland. So really trying to understand the habitat types is going to help us to know, as we're thinking about connectivity, what sorts of species are using it. So on the printed out form, you have a diagram of a road with habitat types listed, and you can just circle what's on either side of the road. On the online form, it's a series of check boxes, just as the way the different programs work. And so those are sort of the two nuts and bolts pieces. And then we get into barriers. And this is sort of the next biggest piece, right? So you've told me the amount of traffic, the amount of development, whether or not you see signs of wildlife. And then you're going to tell me habitat types and then the barriers that exist. Our most common barriers are things like these rocky embankments that are going to really shift wildlife movement, or particularly in this picture, potentially eliminate a lot of movement from many species. Guardrails are a sort of interesting one, and that's another place where it's going to matter what sort of species you're thinking about, connectivity for whom. But they're good to know about, because for some species that's going to entirely shift their movement. It's going to serve as an obstacle, and for others, they can pass through it. Fencing is a big one, and a particularly big one that I find is easy to miss if you drive the linkage. I was out in a really rural part of Connecticut assessing a linkage. And I drove down the road ahead of my linkage assessment training and I was like, oh great, this is a nice quiet back road. We'll be able to walk it. We had a big group of volunteers. This will be great. So we're walking along and I was like, this isn't very interesting. There's forest on either side. And then I started looking, and about 20 feet into the woods, there was a 10-foot tall fence that ran the whole way along the road. Turns out water company land with reservoirs nearby on either side of the road, so they fenced off the reservoirs. So the only places for wildlife to pass was well-maintained fencing. The only places were where there were breaks in the fencing. So it was a really interesting example of like what I would look at if I were sitting on my computer looking at aerial imagery, be like, this is great. Turns out you walk the road, it's really not great. So fencing is an interesting one. And then lastly, retaining walls. I also leave a space for other on pretty much everything, sort of like you and your volunteers. You might encounter things that we haven't come up with yet or other unique scenarios. So if something appears to be a barrier and it's not in the list, please tell us about it. Feel free to take photos of anything. From there, we also ask you if you encounter a culvert to give us a little bit of data on the culvert. So that's where streams pass under the roadway. So we ask you about the width and the height of the culvert and whether or not there's water flowing through it. It's a really simple understanding of the culvert, but it helps us to know if wildlife could pass through it if they need to. From there, we ask you to take all of this data, so traffic, development, habitat types, barriers, and rate the linkage for us on a scale from excellent to poor. We've given you sort of some pictures and a little bit of word prompts to give you an idea of what we're thinking about. And really critically, I want you to rate these linkages for your community or your county. Don't think about the whole corridor. I want to know, because that dilutes the scale, right? If you are a quiet rural community, I want to know what your worst linkage is, not that it's still better than Interstate 84. If we rated every linkage for the whole corridor, then we wouldn't have a very good understanding at different scales of what's happening. So I want to know from the local perspective whether this is an excellent or poor linkage. That means that I have linkages rated on the landscape as poor that are pretty decent for some of our more suburban or urban towns. That's okay because we know where they are and how this fits into the big picture. So, and you can also select 2 categories. I often have a hard time deciding between good and fair. You will find that if it's a really nice forested linkage, but it's State Route 22, how do you rate that linkage? You got nice forest, nice cover, but cars drive really fast on 22 and there's a lot of traffic and there's often some guardrails scattered in, and so there's a substantial amount of roadkill, but there's not a lot we can do from a habitat perspective on either side of the road. So linkages like that, it can often be hard, and you talk to different people and someone will say fair and someone will say good. So I did not limit you to one choice. You can pick 2. And so that sort of wraps it up and really gets you to, we have one last question where I ask you what the most significant barrier is. And I ask you to give me solutions, because that's the next fun part. All of this ultimately funnels down to us making a change on the landscape and being able to ensure there's connectivity on the landscape. So you review the map, you walk or drive that section of road, collect your data, submit the assessment form. It comes to me and the data is uploaded to the map. And then it informs action. And I just really quickly want to pass through these things. When it comes to action, it can do things like inform strategic land conservation. There's instances where it's a nice quiet back road. There's not a lot of traffic, but maybe it's at risk for development, and maybe that's the most critical linkage. And so conservation is the logical next step. In other scenarios, it's going to require a lot more work. Sometimes it's going to require working with the local landowners to understand that they're in a critical connectivity area, and maybe much like pollinator pathways or other initiatives, maybe we need to think about how we're managing our landscapes and who's moving through them and how we can improve cover or improve forage or other things for species to be able to better move throughout our very much parcelized private landscape. Traffic is our #1 barrier, and it's also a hazard for all of us driving on the roads, and is also the hardest place to have a solution. The signs on the left don't really do a lot. This research has shown that these don't change human behavior. I can tell you that I've driven by so many wildlife crossing signs and never seen wildlife. I went to college in Maine and was always looking for the moose, especially when you see the moose crossing sign, you're like, today's the day. Never seen a moose when I've seen a moose crossing sign. So there, with evolving technology, our signage is improving. So on the right are 2 examples. One is an example where they're detecting when large species are nearby the road and the lights start to flash. So that's an example of like interactive signage where it's not this passive, oh, I see the sign every day, but it's like, oh, the lights are flashing, I'm at risk, let me pay attention. And the one on the bottom is an example of when you have seasonal patterns. So maybe when the amphibians are migrating, you can put up, you know, the temporary road signs that tell you to watch for a certain species. Again, sort of this temporal thing where you're not constantly driving by it. You talked about tunnels under the roadway and other ways for improving passage. So sometimes we can't do anything. You know, you think about Interstate 84, the Taconic, and maybe some of our big state routes, and the only solutions are going to be related to infrastructure. And so it's going to be about how do we get species underneath the road. And that's where we work closely with other partners like the Nature Conservancy and others to do a more intensive analysis of the culverts to really understand what currently exists. And if you were to retrofit or upgrade that culvert, how do we improve it for wildlife passage? So the top right is an example of a retrofit. They put what they call a critter shelf, and they actually did this up in the Adirondacks. They put what they call a critter shelf through the culvert. So it's a metal tube that now has a shelf on it so that bobcats and other sort of bobcat and smaller critters can pass through this culvert. They've gotten a lot of success with this shelf. Critters are indeed using it, but it can also be with railroad tracks, having a tunnel underneath the railroad tracks because they're too steep for salamanders to crawl up and over. And the same is also true with curbing. We usually have our curbing at a pretty close to a 90-degree angle, and that's too steep for salamanders and turtles. You can't get up and over it, and so instead you can do a slightly more angled curb that's going to allow them to be able to pass up and over it, and it's still going to push water down the roadway. So there's ways that we can think about our infrastructure and work with our highway departments and departments of transportation to really think about infrastructure, again, in those places where it's really key, right? You don't want to build one of these culverts, spend a lot of money to have that happen, and then have it not be in a critical place or have no species use it. So really thinking critically about where we put this infrastructure. And with that, this is my contact information. This is not our last slide. I'm passing it back over to Brian.
Mandates in New York State when they build new roads, they have to consider that now, or?
They tried really hard to pass a wildlife crossing bill in the last session. And it passed the Senate, but not it never made it to the floor in the Assembly. So that would have pushed for additional regulations around building roadways. But to my knowledge, other than that attempt, there's not something that requires new roadways to be built to a certain standard. There are certain federal funds that are now requiring like certain levels. So in order to be able to access, say, additional funds, you need to put in, you know, certain, oftentimes it's aquatic connectivity related, because that also then relates to flood resilience. So those two are really nicely tied together. But no, we don't have anything regulating quite yet.
But this kind of data would be the kind of data that could lead to those types of regulations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope.
Very cool. I want more critter shells. Critter shells is like the most adorable thing I've ever heard in my life. And yeah, we'll be sending out Julia's contact information here tomorrow, along with the link to this video and the other links that we've talked about tonight. So I'm just gonna advance past that and just talk a little bit about how the DLC can further support follow the list. So we obviously think this is a pretty awesome program. We're already in the business of conserving land, and we focus on connectivity with our conservation easements, be it forested, agriculture, waterways. So any way we can help out, better. We have a lending library of sorts. So we have a couple of iPads. We have 2 now, we're getting 2 more. And we have a whole cache of orange vests, really fashionable, and orange helmets if you want to go out and be on the side of the road. Again, I followed Julia's advice and avoid 684 and
Yeah.
maybe some parts of 22 where it gets
Yes.
very narrow. Maybe you can assess that bridge from the bridge and not really try to walk across it, that kind of thing.
And if you can't get the data, your safety is more important to me than the data.
Agreed. So yeah, you can always reach out to me and I can loan you a couple iPads and, or even just if you want to go the old school route, I can print some stuff out for you and give you some clipboards. Clipboards always make you look official. That's what Julie and I always say when we head out to the field, you gotta bring a clipboard. And then we can also host events too, right? So we were talking a little bit about, and you mentioned private landowners too. So we work with a lot of our easement holders on how they can, remove invasive species and identifying vernal pools and stuff like that. So we could even go out and teach how, private landowners how to do this if they have a linkage on their property. We could support municipalities and CACs if they would like to do an event like this focused on the town linkages that they might have after assessing the map online. And then we'd love to host an event. We haven't come up with a date yet because we wanted to have this event first, but hopefully sometime in the fall or the spring, we'll go out and assess the wild. We have our new preserve and it is not quite open to the public yet, but there are some forest linkages by it. So that's some work that we might be able to get out and do in advance of it opening up. And again, collecting that good data to say, help us manage that land. So this seems like a really cool community science program that really gets down to the nitty gritty of how the data that you collect is then used by the organizations that need that data essentially. And then would it be a presentation if I didn't talk about the DLC's upcoming events, right? So next Saturday, I expect everybody here to be at Explore Stissing. It's mandatory to be coming here tonight, or online, it's mandatory. No, it's gonna be a really cool event next Saturday. Show up at the Thompson Pond Trailhead and Pine Plains. We have a gear swap, we have a meet and greet, we have a ribbon cutting for the new Thompson Pond to Tower Trail. We have outdoor activities hosted by the Carey Institute. We have a wetland walk, a pollinator walk, a geology walk. There's free food, free t-shirts. It's gonna be really, really cool. Then of course we have our habitat cleanup that we do every year with Audubon, New York. We got a lot of folks signed up to that. That's really cool. And then our annual volunteer open house, which is always really fun. Same room you're in right now, and maybe you're seeing online. Lots of snacks, lots of drinks. We have a really good time, usually play a game. And then also our winter webinar series, Earth Matters, will be starting in November. So it'll be every first Wednesday of the month from November to August. We have really cool. Oh, yeah, it's only April. Sorry, we don't do it that long. We're not that advantageous. That's a long series. And this year will be focused on a lot of local topics in the Hudson Valley. So I think you're going to be I'm really excited for everyone to see what the topics are and the presenters are. And then, yeah, we thank you all for showing up tonight and attending online. And we'd like to open the floor to any questions you might have for Julia.
I just have a question. How does this integrate with natural resources inventories?
That's an excellent question. And something that is still evolving. In Connecticut, there is a similar tool that the name is not coming to me, but we have integrated it via the mapping and some of the goals related to natural resources. And I think the same could be very much true in New York, where you can incorporate some of this mapping into the natural resource inventory. If you have the whole town assessed, then you can say we have knowledge on each of these local connectivity points, and that can help feed into the mapping and the work related to natural resource inventories. So I think it's illogical, it goes hand in hand for sure. Other questions?
I always, when I'm out collecting data, want to get to the next point, is quantity or quality more important? Like, would you rather have all 850 linkages filled quickly, or would you rather have, you know, this is a slow trickle and like really high quality data collected?
High quality.
Okay,
I think that from a computer, you can glean a decent amount of information. And so if we needed to know a decent amount of information about every linkage, we could pretty quickly, probably using a computer, collect that information, but really understanding what the local volunteers seeing on the ground is much more useful. And when you go to set out and make a plan for a series of linkages, the more, there's a lot of notes sections. So I leave you space to describe everything you're seeing if you feel so inclined. The more information you give us, the easier it's going to be when someone goes, right? Because I'm essentially from behind my desk, I'm trying to see what you're seeing on the ground. So the more information you give us, the better we can develop connectivity planning and work with partners to really say, we have all of this information about this spot. So quality over quantity for sure.
How often do you need to assess the same?
Right now, we're going with once. At some point, we're gonna have to assess linkages again, right? The landscape changes. One of the benefits to doing this as a community science project is you all live in these communities. Once you go out and look at a linkage, you're gonna drive through there and be like, that's that linkage I looked at. And if a whole forest gets cleared, you're gonna know that, right? You're gonna have to pass it and be like, wow, my linkage changed. And so if it changes, you can submit another form to me. But right now, my goal is to assess everything once. And then we're thinking, is it a 3-year interval? Is it a 5-year interval? Is it that we have local folks on the ground who know when it changes? Or is it when you go out to do a project, you confirm that everything fits, right? If we're really creating action, do we then say, we have an action plan, let's recheck the linkage and then we'll do the work?
Is there an optimum time of day?
That's a really good question. I haven't gotten that question. I would say not necessarily. I
So I guess the
pause.
wildlife would be better early, but then the traffic
Yeah.
would be.
And it's gonna depend on what road you're on, right? How busy, what the traffic patterns are. And I don't ask you anything about the time of day that you're assessing the linkage. So you are welcome. If it feels, I tend to go with, if it feels like it's critically important, like you're asking yourself, you know, the road and you're like, wow, I'm assessing this in the middle of the day, it's extra quiet and it's busy during rush hour. That's information you can add to the notes field to say, you know,
Maybe you should add time.
maybe I should,
Because it crossed my mind when you were talking about traffic.
because I asked the date that you do it, because right, the time of year matters. If you're out in the winter time, if there's snow, you're more likely to see tracks. Tracks can obviously tell us a lot. But in trying to collect all of this data, I can't just limit us, particularly with how little snow we get these days. I can't limit us to days there's snow. But maybe I will start asking about time. That's interesting. Yeah, good question. The questions on Zoom.
Not yet.
have you heard of the wildlife crossing on I-90 in Washington State?
Yes.
Okay, I figured.
I pulled out the picture of the really pretty, there's a couple of really big bridges that are incredible. So they make bridges that are for wildlife to pass over. I've toyed with where we could or should have one in the Northeast. The only challenge being again, right, like they have these big migrations and like big, like wildlife tend to move more in herds there than we move more, a little more piecemeal. But wouldn't it be incredible if you were driving down like 84 or 90 and you like, I think the impact of seeing the bridge is something to think about in addition to what it does for the species.
Yeah, the bridge is almost like a tourist destination, and it's like kind of pretty. They have like animal prints on the side of it.
Have some around.
We have some tunnels.
Or some bridges with grass, just grass on it. Where was
Isn't
it?
that one in New Jersey?
New Jersey.
Ooh.
Jersey.
Are they old bridges that were left?
I think so.
Open it that quarry area.
Oh, yeah, right. 387.
Really?
Yeah, there might be one. That's-
I'm gonna have to look this up. Okay, that's cool.
Field trip.
Yeah.
Did you see the video of the the coyote and the badger going under the coal.
Yes, yes, that's one of my favorites. There's some, I have a still in another presentation, I have a still from that image. One of our partners got a really good video of deer using a bridge and going under a bridge. And last summer, our interns found a deer under a culvert and she's actually giving birth in the culvert. And we talked with some wildlife biologists and the concept was that it was probably quiet and cooler than the ambient temperature. And so she was using the culvert to give birth. That's interesting. Yeah, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes with connectivity. I love it.
I imagine you have.
Excellent.
There's no questions online. I would say just keep an eye on your emails for the recording of this, so you can go back and watch it and for all the links, and then keep an eye on the DLC and HBA so we can plan some events together and get out in the field and do this stuff because it's really fun.
And it really all comes together when you like assess your first linkage. You go out there and you're like, I understand.
Yeah.
So don't be intimidated to try it.
So you have a team within lobbies to protect that language or maintain?
So we work closely with partners to then come up with strategies. And it depends sort of where in the landscape we're talking about, right? I think you all came in after my maps, but the Follow the Forest corridor is much larger than the Housatonic watershed, which is where we focus a lot of our efforts. And just in general, we tend to work really closely with partners. So it's going to depend a little bit what the next action step is. In the scenario where there are linkages near DLC's new preserve that's not yet open, that would be we communicate with DLC and they would choose what sort of action steps they want to take from there, right? It's each individual partner's choice as to what they do next. We do work closely with private landowners in scenarios where there's really key places for riparian connectivity or terrestrial connectivity to improve habitat there where we can. And then sometimes it's going to be planning at the town level to think about what does this look like on the town level, where can the highway department plug in. Sometimes it's going to be lobbying at the state or federal level, which we do as well. So it's never a straight answer because it's a suite of tools that are going to get us to this picture.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay, thanks for joining us in person.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us online. We really appreciate the attendance tonight, and hopefully we'll be out there with cool orange vests and clipboards in our hands sooner than later. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, Julie.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I
We really
appreciate it.
appreciate your time.
You all will get my contact information, but don't hesitate to reach out with questions. Filling out a form, you have questions, I'm always available. Feel free to ask them.
I'm curious, how many volunteers have you had so far?
That is one of the numbers that I don't look at very often, and you are probably the third person to ask me this, and I keep telling myself I need to count. I want to say that the last time I counted, we had over 50.
We're just talking small groups and lobbies.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Bring that out, right? So you kind of 1,000 citizens.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Who aren't- That's what, they have other jobs, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Volunteer hours. I say it at all our events.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all have heard it. Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah,
True.
it helps out in more than one way.
It does, it really does. So I'm gonna count that number. Next time I see you, I'll have a good answer for you. Awesome. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
There's stickers and handouts over there. If y'all want them.
There's also a lot of gallery to go over. Gonna go back in there. You're not kidding, we have to just walk back. Yes, it is. Sorry, but without caffeinated, we have seltzers and mascots. Oh, please, yeah.
Why is it not going over there?
Yeah, please, go right ahead. You don't have to ask me, you do enough.